Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again. In this short video, I just wanted to give my thoughts on a comment and a kind of a short response that was made, appeared on Twitter and was part of a coaching seminar from the Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland group, which I recently had on the podcast. The idea, challenging the value of theory for coaching, right? And the specific quote is skill acquisition theory is psychobabble that confuses coaches. And so what I want to do is give you my perspective on this. And to foreshadow, I'm actually going to have a Q&A session at the end of the Movement Skill Acquisition Ireland seminar series now. And maybe we'll revisit this if anyone has any questions. But so what am I talking about here? So what I'm talking about here specifically are comments that Mark Williams made, Professor Mark Williams, I've had on the show a few times already, my podcast. He made when asked. So he did a seminar, the opening seminar of the series, and he was asked his thoughts on the debate between the ecological approach to skill and the information processing cognitive approach to skill. The two theories that I've talked a lot about. And what I'm going to do is start by playing this little clip to show you his response to this question.
My view would be that I think this differentiation between cognitive and ecological psychology is significantly over-egged, to be honest with you. If you go back and read, for instance, the article that Nikki Hodges and I wrote for JSS in 2005, it goes something like effective practice and instruction in soccer challenging tradition. And it was mainly written from a cognitive psychology perspective. But if you look at the practical implications of it, it pretty much mirrors whatever article you would read written by someone with a bigger slant towards dynamical systems theory. So, and in fact, the notion of manipulating constraints, which I'm wholly supportive of, is not a conceptual framework. It is a working framework, but it's not theoretically driven framework. So I think in essence, it seems to me that we're all arguing pretty similar things in the sense that the question of what is the least amount of instruction that we need to provide, is that not what we're saying from a cognitive psychology and a dynamical systems ecological perspective? The fact that practice must mimic the demands of competition as best as possible, and a great way to do that is to manipulate the constraints. I guess I'd say that whether my theoretical framework was cognitive science or ecological psychology. And then, let's provide the least amount of feedback and focus on being more hands-off in the process than hands-on. So I purposely do not talk about theory when I do any of my coach ed stuff, because I think it's just psychobabble that confuses coaches. And to some degree, I just give practical tools around what we know about learning. So to some degree, I don't. If I was being cantankerous, which I probably more often am, and controversial, I'd say that it's hindering us rather than helping us, this debate, because it just confuses coaches.
Okay, so that was Mark's answer to that question. And as I said, obviously, here I'm not trying to attack Mark. He doesn't need any defending, right? He's a very, very accomplished and incredibly a prolific skill acquisition researcher, done a lot in the field. So I'm not meant an attack in any way. Mark and I are friends, and I've had him on the podcast a couple of times, as I mentioned. But obviously, I completely and utterly disagree with this opinion. So I wanted to address some of his specific points and just kind of on the surface level. And what you're going to see throughout my response is I'm going to refer to a lot of my own material, the videos I've created, some of the blog posts I've created. I'm not trying to do this. I hope it doesn't come across as just self-promotional. Well, obviously you found me. So the reason I'm doing this is because I've talked a lot about this before, and I don't want to just rehash the same thing. So I'm going to try to point to places where I've talked about it. So I'm going to pull out a few key points I got out of Mark's response there and address them. First of all, is that the idea that manipulating constraints is not a theoretical framework. The idea that the constraints model, Newell's constraint idea, is not a theoretical framework. I think so. I think I'm correct in identifying that what this comes from. And if you want more of Mark's opinion on it, I think he would point you to this article. So this was an article he wrote in response to Paul Glazier's grand unifying theory, right? Which I covered in episode 342. So Mark was asked to write a commentary to Paul's theory, in which he basically is talking about using constraints as kind of a theory that encapsulates all coaching, all sports performance ideas across all the domains of biomechanics, psychology, right? So I covered it in that episode if you want more detail. But within Mark's response, and this was with Paul Ward, he raised this. We see some value in the framework presented by Newell. We acknowledge that the framework has been embraced by several domains. It can provide a helpful descriptive framework that illustrates the complex interactions that exist between theory. Yet, while the approach may have some utility as a descriptive and illustrative framework, ultimately it falls considerably short of the type of unifying theory posed by Glaser. It does not satisfy some of the basic criteria required by the scientific community to constitute a theory. It does not present any testable hypotheses and offers no predictions about future behaviors, which can be used to provide support for or challenge the theory. So Mark is questioning kind of the key points of falsifiability and kind of what we can actually test from this. And this is a point, on some levels, I agree with this. This is a point that I raised. I posted this figure on Twitter that raised everybody's ire, right? Newell's constraints theory, the idea that behavior emerges out of the task, individual, and environmental constraints, covers every single type of coaching. If you use Newell's definition of what constraints are, every single type of coaching is a constraints manipulation. It covers everything. Cones are a constraint. A verbal constraint to bend your knees at exactly this angle is a constraint. A small-sided game is a constraint. Everything falls in one of these three categories, right? It covers everything. What differs, right, is why you manipulate the constraints, right? In a traditional prescriptive coaching, right, we use constraints to try to get you to one ideal solution. You're still manipulating constraints, right? Whereas with the CLA and differential learning and the ecological approach, we're using constraints to encourage self-organization and exploration, right? So Mark is true. I agree with Mark that constraints itself, Newell's overall constraints, is not, it's a theory, but it cannot be used in the way to generate specific predictions unless you narrow it down, right? You got to link it with dynamical systems, with the self-organization idea, right? So you need the rest of his diagram, which Newell does, right? Newell has this in there, but most people just jump right here, right? The idea that you need Newell's search theory, which has tons of predictions, right, about how we learn and how we're going to change our behavior, right? So excuse me, if you go to the full kind of constraints idea, which is like not just the superficial triangle, right, and get into the rest of the idea that behavior is self-organized, emerges, you search the perceptual motor landscape, and and this, I've kind of drawn this in the CLA, then it is a testable theory. It's been tested in a bunch of different papers and studies, right? And it has specific predictions about what and how you should manipulate the constraints, what effects they're going to have, right? You can talk about Lee et al.'s tennis study where they looked at different clusters of, right, there's specific prediction, right? So, and about decision making, more creativity, less reduction of injury, all these kind of things I've talked about on the podcast, right? So yes, if you use a very superficial definition of constraints, just the triangle itself, I agree it's not a theoretical framework. But if you pull in the full ecological dynamics ideas and Newell's full ideas, linking it to learning a search, and then it is. I disagree with that point. So I don't concur with that point. Okay, so that's the first idea I would raise. The second one, and the most big one for me, is Mark says basically the practical implications for coaching are the same for the two skill acquisition theories. I don't really believe this at all. It would be true if you believe that we can boil skill acquisition, the years and decades of research we've done in motor learning and skill acquisition, to just some generalities like practice should be game-like and coaching should be more hands-off. I would hope we could do a little better than that, right? The problem is, yes, there on the surface, what we should be doing could be classified as being similar for different approaches, right? We should be more game-like. We should be more less instruction and feedback, as Mark said. But the why and the how and the when is different, right? What exactly does it mean to be game-like, right? That answer to that question is very, very different depending on your theory, right? In information processing, game-like are things that have similar perceptual cognitive demands, working memory demands, intentional demands, right? In representative learning design theory, game-like are things that have same information sources, action fidelity, right? So they're very, very different. So how you go about making practice game-like, right? How you go about using this advice, when and how, uh, heavily depends on your theoretical stance, right? And this was a point I raised a couple episodes ago, also in the podcast about the challenge point paper by Nikki Hodges and Keith Loesch, right? You need a theory to implement these practical ideas consistently in any useful way, right? Um, and so let me point to another thing, right? So this is a recent paper Mark published, right? And I reviewed in this recent episode 382, the use of contextual priors and kinematic information during anticipation in sport toward a Bayesian integration framework. From the title, without ever even listening to that episode, is very clear. There's a clear theoretical slant, right? That's an information processing slant to that paper. Right. So if Mark is true, is this type of work and the work that people on the ecological side do, just pardon my French, intellectual masturbation, right? Is it no value at all to sports science, right? We're publishing it in a sport journal. By Mark's saying, right, to me, this implies all of this, right? All of this you can boil down to you need to take into account your opponent's tendencies, right? All of this working and developing a model, right? Is it all just a waste of time for actual coaching and practice, right? I don't think so. Even like if I really was on this side of the fence and I believe this, I would want to take this and design practice designed to develop these contextual priors, right? Let's have a film session where we talk about the team's tendencies and talk about all these kind of how to pick up kinematic information and all this. Talk about knowledge about, right? If you believe that, right, you really think this is value, this research, then why not take it onto the field in that specific way, right? And on the same point, going back to whether they have the same practical implications, they don't, right? They don't at all, because I, as ecological psychologist, don't believe in contextual priors. So I wouldn't want to develop a practice session where we work on developing those, right? So I don't agree with that idea at all. Again, like, this theoretical framework has value in guiding, in my opinion, right? The other point I'll raise is I've talked about this before in these blog posts. The two theories give very different implications for how you go about implementing some of these general concepts that Mark talks about, right? How do you make a task easier for a new learner, right? Or someone that's struggling? Do you break it into parts, or you do simplify it by changing equipment, for example? Those are two very different approaches, right? One of them, if you believe in cognitive load theory, that you just have to reduce the load and demands on the athlete, then decomposition is fine. If you believe in ecological dynamics, that's not fine, right? When do we use variability? How and when, right? Do we throw it in a relatively large amount right at the start to make you adaptable, or do you make you adjustable, right? This is kind of another thing that I've talked about, right? So for me, maybe they have the answer of what we're trying to do, add variability to practice, is similar, but how we actually go about using that effectively and consistently in a practice design, you have to understand the theory and tie it to the theory, right? And this is, linking back to the kind of the big videos I've made, the two skill acquisition approaches and roots, not branches. These are where I go into detail how I see these things differently, right? How the theory is branching out and creating different practical implications, right? So I do not agree at all with the idea that different theories lead to similar practical applications, right? The only way they do is if you stick on a highly superficial level, right? Without getting down. Like Mark says, we need to be hands off and not talk as much and give less feedback. Well, how do we know when we should be giving feedback and what type, right? What's the answer to that? The answer depends on what theory you ascribe to, right? Always, right? In my opinion. So I think maybe, so I think this is always important. So is modal learning theory psychobabble that confuses coaches? Maybe it's confusing at times, right? And I can't speak for coaches. There's a lot of coaches that I work with that want to learn it, right? And want to understand the incredible intricacies of it. This is something I was shocked about in my podcast, right? I never thought people would want to learn about metastability and things like that. I thought that was psychobabble, right? No one cared about, but people do. So I think this is that it confuses coaches is a way overgeneralization. Maybe it confuses some, and this is an issue of terminology that keeps coming up and up. But the debate to me is not watering it down and getting rid of the specifics of the theory and the guidance it could provide. And Mark's credit that really great study on contextual priors and a model. It's not throwing that away and saying we can't use that in any way in coaching, right? It's by educating, right? It's by making this less babbly, right? By trying to get people to understand the terminology, by trying to educate coaches in whatever theory you ascribe to, right? So I fundamentally do not agree with Mark's points he's raising here. And obviously, as I said, you can find out more specifics of why. I understand, and this is, as I said, is a feeling I get a lot, right? This issue of terminology. Andrew Wilson and I just raised it. If you haven't listened to the most recent episode of the podcast on talking about the role of memory in the ecological approach, we start with a whole session about terminology again. So it's something that keeps coming up and up. So I understand the kind of frustration with it. But in any scientific field, you need to kind of invest something in understanding the theory and to use it effectively. So as I said, I fundamentally don't agree with Mark's points, but I respect his opinion, of course. And he's written, as I said, I have linked to some of the things he's written on. So as I mentioned at the start, I am going to Mark open the series with this very kind of provocative thing I showed. I'm going to end. I'm not doing any type of presentation. I'm just doing a Q&A on the ecological approach and constraints. So we can dive. If anyone has any questions they want to dive back into, I'm sure we can touch on them there. It's going to be a very open session. So it's going to be on April 11th, I believe. So hopefully I'll see you then. So thanks for joining me and listening to my thoughts on this. This is Rob Gray from the Perception Action Podcast, and cheers for now.